Hi, this is the Philosophical Angle program, and I'm your host, Chris Angle. I'm the author of 4 books on philosophy, one of which is The Philosophical Equations of Economics, and these books are available free for viewing online at www.philosophypublishing.com. The purpose of the Philosophical Angle is to examine the nature of concepts being used in current media, and this week we're going to discuss some of the things that were on the campaign trail, which were about Detroit's inner cities and why they're so poor, as candidate Trump went and visited Detroit, and this subject came up. So let's talk about it. Let's analyze and discuss this situation first. It should be noted that the Democrats have controlled the government of these cities for the last 50 years, all of them. So what's the problem? They're supposed to be so caring of the poor. Well, the problem is that they're all receiving state and federal money in the form of welfare for their constituents and subsidy payments from the government. Now, why would this be a problem? And why has this caused the inner cities to remain so poor? And not only and for 50 years. Well, there are 2 problems. First is, originally, the cities were well off up until the early 1960s. Detroit was the wealthiest town in the land. And then they lost everything. Lost its wealth. Much of its population moved out. And the second problem is that those that remain have stayed poor. There has been no improvement. They only are getting poorer. Detroit's a shambles, and as well as Detroit, and as well as Baltimore and Los Angeles and others. Well, the main cause for losing wealth is the raising of taxes. That is, somewhere in each city's history, there was a systematic call for raising the denizens of these cities and their taxes. In Detroit's case, it was an uber-liberal mayor named Coleman Young who became mayor in the 1970s. And he was a communist, really. So this systematic call for raising taxes, I believe, is because the progressive Democratic left likes to raise taxes in order to accomplish their primary goal of social equality, which translates into their objective of social justice. Everybody should be equal in life, and of course, raising taxes on those who have more will be a way to accomplish this social justice. And there is a reason why they think that everybody should be equal to accomplish this social justice. They believe that other people are inherently bad, so much so that when they deal with them, that is the other people, these people try to unfairly exploit other people. And because of this exploitation, some have more and some have less. And obviously, this needs to be corrected with regulations and taxes so that no one does get too far ahead of the other. Because when one gets more, it was done unfairly through exploitation and through taking advantage of others. Thus, when the Democratic Party took over all the cities in the early 60s, they first raised taxes. However, when people have their taxes raised, that means they will have less for themselves. The natural reaction is to move to a locality that has less taxes so that they can keep more of what they have. It's a natural reaction. All humans do this, even the progressives. Good or bad, it doesn't matter. It's human nature. You want to keep what you have, and that is making your life good, and you want that to continue. So those that have more move away to keep what they have for now, to another locale to avoid the higher taxes. Those who had not so much stayed put and gained nothing. But what they've lost is their tax base. So now they don't have as much for the government to spend on their infrastructure, on their schools, and the other liabilities of whatever the government usually pays for. So it's a net loss. That is, the Democrats are employing a losing strategy. And the opposite strategy would be to lower taxes, invite in more business, grow the economy, and it would be a net positive. Okay, now to the second problem. The problem is that why is it that they stayed poor? The answer is that it is because of welfare. And why is this, everybody asks? It is because the risk-reward ratio of that which governs the incentive factor in economics. Economic decisions are governed by incentive. That is, when you decide to do something economically, an incentive is present. For example, a student graduates from high school. He asks himself, he asks that famous Shakespearean question, to work or not to work? That is the question. So, due to the unlimited, a principle in economics called the unlimited demand for the good, he wants to do good for his life. He wants to buy a car, take out his girlfriend. He wants to go down and get a hamburger. All the normal things a young man would want to do. So everybody has this demand for this type of good. Well, when he weighs his priorities in his mind, what he really does is he understands the sacrifice that's involved with getting the resources in order to be able to get the rewards of what we just talked about in these little examples of going down and seeing a sports game or something. This is because there is an economic equation that governs all economic behavior. The equation is that the sacrifice equals the reward. And the sacrifices of our high school graduate here consists of his time and his effort and his knowledge to obtain a reward within an atmosphere or an environment of risk, which all life has. And this incentive, or this sacrifice, is another word for work. So does he work? So now we have the incentive question. You must weigh the ratio of the sacrifice to the reward that he will receive after he executes his sacrifice. The smaller the sacrifice relative to the size of the reward, the more the incentive improves. So now he sees that a normal sacrifice, that with a normal sacrifice, he's going to get a lot of reward, which consists of fulfilling at least of his basic needs plus some extra for his life to spend on his girlfriend, on his food, on his movies, or whatever other recreational activities he likes. And but he's got to do it within the confines of the reward. So he concludes that he will do it. He will work. He will make the sacrifice to get his reward because the incentive is there. Of course, he's just starting out, so it's not a lot, but it's enough to get along. It's not bad. It's a start. But now someone throws a spanner into the situation. This would be welfare. Let's see what happens to our basic economic equation and the incentive factor here. Now the government comes along and offers him a welfare situation. It's equivalent to his first job. He will get enough to pay the rent and have a couple bucks in his pocket, although not a lot. And although it's equivalent or almost equivalent to the first job, what has changed is the incentive factor. It is now very different. This is because the sacrifice is very little, almost nothing. but the reward is the same as the first entry-level job. So the incentive ratio is very, very high to take the welfare check and leave the first job behind. So in analyzing, if we just take a little look at this a little bit further, the sacrifice is going to consist of his time, his information and knowledge that he gained in high school, his effort, and the risk in doing the job. Let's compare this to the sacrifice of the welfare. No risk, no knowledge needed, and now it requires no effort and no time. His basic needs are met inside the reward. As welfare can continue indefinitely, there is no incentive to change over to work, and thus the cities remain poor. But let's ask our two political analysts. We have Remy Canario from Washington, D.C., political analyst there, and Rick Samuelson out in the West Coast, a venture capitalist. Guys, what do you think? Why have the cities remained so poor? Remy, you want to go first?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, I think that as with any kind of social, it is probably overly simplistic to look at any one explanation as being the root cause. Now, the fact of the matter is that the populations of inner cities are largely heterogeneous and don't really.
Remy, can you come a little bit closer?
The populations of inner cities around this country are made up of about 20 to 25% people who are solidly middle class, and 60% who are either working class or part of the working poor, which means that around 80 to 85% of the populations in these areas are working. Now, that in and of itself, I think, presents a challenge to the idea that welfare is what has kept these areas so persistently disadvantaged. Another challenge is the makeup of TANF, which are welfare as called today, which has a stipulation that a recipient must find work within 2 years of starting assistance, and that there is a limit of 60 months over any one person's lifetime where they can receive that assistance. I do think that whenever you have a program like welfare, there are conflicts, there are misaligned incentives. But we have a lot of indication that the environment that children grow up in has a lot to do with their later economic success. And the reason why I think that the correct thing to do is to provide the assistance, regardless of the fact that it does skew incentives, is that we are not only talking about the breadwinners in this economic situation. The children who grew up in disadvantaged homes do less well than their peers from wealthier families. And so if you're talking about cutting welfare, you are talking about making sure that this cycle reproduces by ensuring that these children grow up in even worse circumstances than they would otherwise. Now that's just one part of the equation. Another part of the equation, I think, would have to do with the fact that there's been shown to be a high correlation between the level of segregation in a particular city, along with a lack of economic mobility. Atlanta is the poster child for this. It's one of the most segregated cities and one with the least social mobility. We have to talk about the physical environments themselves. We saw what happened in Flint, Michigan. And the fact of the matter is that exposure to lead has very real and very negative consequences for children throughout their lives after exposure when they're young. We also have to talk about the fact that living in poverty has been shown to essentially come with very real impact, negative impact on someone's IQ. I mean, just the simple stresses of having to be able to find enough to eat, deal with a violent environment, it has been shown to be enough to reduce someone's IQ score substantially. So there are no easy solutions here, and I'm just touching on a few of the different elements that feed into this cycle. I think that a more holistic approach is really the only way that any policy changes would be able to deal with the problem effectively.
Rick?
Well, a couple of observations. I mean, during the time that taxes have, in many cases, risen in cities, and on a net basis, people have left many cities. Detroit being the most extreme example. You've also seen a tremendous rise in single-parent families. Part of that driven by the requirements of welfare. When I worked in the ghetto in Bridgeport right after college, I found that the actual inhabitants of what was called the ghetto, essentially, are extremely well informed with respect to the various government programs that they might gain access to. And that in many cases they would have children with one or more men and deliberately not marry in order to maximize those benefits. And so, I mean, they're rational actors. They're not stupid. The other thing is that the economy in the ghetto has its own type of kind of perverse efficiency. Cars get robbed, electronic stores get robbed. No one ever seems to wonder, where does this stuff go? Does the perpetrator who robs 20 television sets actually use the 20 television sets? Or the repeat car thief, do they actually need 15 cars? No, of course not. What happens in the ghetto is that there are black market shops you can go into, and you go in the back room, and they will have, 100 different television sets. They'll have, in another type of shop, they'll have numerous cars, right, that have been stolen. And, they scrub these cars and of their identification, and they on-sell these various products, and there's quite a range, right? It's not just television sets. You can get pretty much any electronic good, a washing machine or whatever it is you need. And so when you go into a ghetto home, what's most striking is that they have a lot of stuff. Okay, I've been to a whole bunch of them. They have all the modern conveniences that anybody else has, with almost no exception. And it's because they are able to purchase these goods, stolen goods, at a tremendous discount. Not everything they purchase is stolen, but big ticket items like TVs and washing machines and so on and so forth are the obvious choice for them to buy on the black market. So the ghetto has its own unreported, largely invisible to the official eye, kind of economy that enables it to function pretty well in terms of providing at least the goods that people in a modern economy want to have. The other thing I would say is I think the educational gap between the cities, the inner cities, and more wealthy communities is significant. There are many reasons for that. But what we've seen most recently with this Stanford study of charter schools in Massachusetts is that the potential gains in educational outcomes, I believe on the verbal side it was a 4 times gain, on the math side it was a 6 times gain vis-a-vis kids in regular public schools. I mean, these are material improvements. Maybe that can't be repeated in every district. Maybe Massachusetts is a bit exceptional, but it seems to me, and we're fighting this battle right now in Washington State, that to address one key area where skills could be improved and educational outcomes could be improved, charter schools should be amongst the highest priorities for all the inner cities, and supporting those with whatever financial resources are required, I should think should be at the top of every priority list.
Okay, guys, you've both declared several types of influences regarding the economies and problems of the inner city. But what I'd like to hear now is, have you got a cure for it? Remy?
Well, I think that I wouldn't be so bold as to say that I have the solution. Of course, education plays into it. Of course, having a law-abiding neighborhood where there's trust between the police and the residents is important. The physical environment is in single households, and this is something that comes up consistently in conversations with conservatives, which is something that I find very interesting because conservatives tend to emphasize the shortcomings of government programs and its inability to affect change, and that's one of the reasons why I prefer a limited government. I just have yet to come across a conservative explanation for how government policy is going to reduce single motherhood. And if those policies don't exist, then I think that the only thing that we can do is to accept that this is a fact of modern life in America and design policies to ensure that the outcomes of children living in those single-parent households are as good as possible.
Rick, a cure?
Well, the only possible cure is to bring more business back into the cities. That's plainly obvious. Detroit's a particular. I drove through Detroit a few years ago. The striking thing about Detroit is the number of abandoned buildings. There are thousands and thousands of abandoned buildings. The last figure I heard was something like 60,000. So you've got a case where people have actually left their homes rather than continue paying mortgages or continue paying property taxes. They've actually abandoned their homes, which is, a pretty economically irrational thing to do unless the taxes are so high and such a burden that you can't possibly get ahead. So the first step is to provide tax incentives for companies and businesses to move into these locations so that they can hire people, so that the people that are hired can afford to live in the cities and make the tax structure attractive enough that they would choose to leave the suburbs or wherever they happen to be and move back in and work. I don't see any other way forward.
Yeah, Remy, last word.
Of course, business has to be at the center of any approach to revitalizing cities as a whole. The question of whether the inner cities are going to be able to attract wealthy taxpayers, whether they're going to participate in any revitalization of, say, Detroit's economy is another question entirely. But without a stronger business presence in a city like Detroit, it's a sine qua non. It just doesn't seem possible. Now, you have a bit of a chicken and an egg situation. If a city is seen as violent, if it's seen as poor, I think that it would take some creative policy making in order to be able to deliver that increased business. But I guess that's the challenge that our policymakers face.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with Rick in really the first step in lowering taxes, because basically, if you go back to what Detroit was, probably the richest city in the United States in 1960. So if you go back to what they had in 1960, their policies then, it should work today, because human beings don't change economically. Their incentive patterns don't change economically overnight. So, and that was lower taxation. Was certainly a first step. So I want to thank you guys for being here, and we're going to see everybody at the next episode. Thanks.
Thank you.